this time. I just want to thank both of the last two speakers, Travis and Mark. There, I thought actually both of them were quite interesting, and it's always nice coming to these events and hearing different perspectives. And I think it's I find it always quite edifying. So, come on, God's presentation are. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, no, I did try that. Oh no, but the wrong way. It was okay for a second. Okay, please let it work. Hopefully this is going to work for me today. I guess first of all, just to respond to one of the things that Travis mentioned earlier. When he was talking about encryption and who's got access to the keys, does the government have access and so on. One of the things that we've always done at Symantec, or at least continuing on from the legacy from PGP, is to publish the source code. So I haven't looked into it for a while, but I really hope that it's something that we're still doing, because I think at least then you can kind of look through and see what the code actually does. Thanks. It's good to be here. It's kind of funny because I was living in England for nearly the last decade, and the first presentation that I did there was in the back of a pub. So it's kind of nice now to just coming back to Canada and now presenting in a bar like this. It's nice to kind of have that experience. So what I'm going to speak about today is first of all, I'm Vernon. I work with Symantec, and I'm going to be talking about some of the trends the security trends that we see at Symantec. So because we have this unparalleled view into what's happening around the world. I've heard numbers like we're filtering something like 25-30% of the world's email. We of course have all of our Norton users and enterprise users, and from that we're pulling all this information in terms of what kind of files people are using and so on, and this kind of big data story gives us a very interesting insight into the trends as we see them changing. So again, I think to kind of mention or to reference what Travis said in terms of are the attacks changing? Is the security landscape changing? Well, I would say that based on what we're seeing, it is very much so. In terms of the big trend that we've seen that we saw from 2012's data is that the rise in targeted attacks has been massive. Okay, so you've probably heard this before, that there's been this big shift away from the really obvious kind of attacks and so on, into these more very specific kind of targeted attacks. And surely from the information, from the numbers that we've crunched from 2012, we've definitely seen that these targeted attacks are very much on the rise. And so I should mention that every year we kind of crunch the numbers from the previous year, and we put out this report called the ISTR. So that's the Internet Security Threat Report. And so that's where I'm pulling a lot of these numbers out, or pulling them from today. So again, this is something that we publish every April. And one of the other big trends that we've seen, or that we saw from last year, is that I think quite often people think that, okay, governments or maybe large companies, or kind of typical well-known companies are the ones that are being attacked the most. But the big change that we saw last year was that we've seen a real shift in attacks that have, in terms of the sheer number of attacks, moving towards the manufacturing sector. And so this is where this doesn't mean that governments are getting attacked any less. It's just purely a fact that we're seeing this massive increase in attacks against the manufacturing sector, and as you can see, likewise finance, insurance, and real estate, and so on. So there has been a bit of a shift there. And in terms of the kinds or the size of organizations that we see getting attacked, well, of course, the larger organizations with more than 2,500 employees, they of course are still getting attacked, and we still see them making up something like 50% of the victims, in terms of the attacks happening. But the interesting change is that it's really on the lower side here. So you'll see that back in 2011, the less than 250 crowd made up something like 18% of the attacks. But we saw this real shift in 2012, where it had jumped to 31% of the total attacks that we've seen. So there are definitely these changes happening. So I would say the threat landscape is very much in flux. And I'm sure everyone here has probably noticed a lot of these changes as well. Now, in terms of the roles, the people's roles, who's actually getting attacked here? And this is where I find quite often people think, oh, it's the C-level types, it's the guys who have their email addresses listed on the web pages and so on. But the reality is that we see all kinds of people getting attacked. And certainly not just those at the C level. And if you think about it, if you're going to attack someone, what's a good way of sending an email to someone and getting them to open up that email and getting them to read the document? Well, if you think about it, right, people in HR, for example, that could be their role. If people are sending them these resumes, and their role is to look at this shared inbox, open up the resume, and so on. That's a great vector to try to get into a company. So again, there's all kinds of these different roles that we see that job functions that are being attacked. And in terms of these kinds of targeted attacks that we're seeing now, of course, spear phishing, this has been around for a while, but this is very much interesting way, or it's one of these ways that these guys start these attacks in terms of crafting emails that are very specific to the job role. So, of course, it's very easy to look on LinkedIn to get information about a given person, and then craft that particular message, to their role. And there was one interesting case that we saw. I think it was last year, where there was an organization, it was sort of a non-profit that was putting out information on U.S.-Taiwanese relations, and there was a conference around that topic. I think it was last September. And we found that there were two people in the organization that were getting these very specifically crafted messages, to their role, around that topic, and these emails were crafted in a way that the average person, it would be it really enticed them into opening up the attachment. So again, we're seeing a lot of these kind of targeted attacks happening in this way. But another big change that we saw last year, 2012 especially, was this trend of watering hole attacks, and so the idea here is that and the reason that we call them watering hole attacks is that it's a little bit like if you think about in Africa, or maybe out in the desert, there's a watering hole, and the little bird is waiting there, and then the the attacker sits and waits by the watering hole for the bird to come along and then attacks them. It's very much the same kind of principle, where they'll target a particular website that has a certain audience associated with it, and then they'll infect that website and wait for the victims to get infected. So there's quite an interesting white paper that we've put out on. There's this group called the Elderwood Gang, and we found that over the last few years. There's been a number, there's a group of individuals or this group that seem to have quite a lot of resources behind them in causing some of these attacks, because they seem to have perhaps access to the source code behind some of the major applications out there, like Adobe and so on, because they seem to be publishing, or rather they seem to be behind a lot of these zero-day types of attacks, where they're making use of vulnerabilities that no one's seen before, and so with their attacks, quite often they also involve some of these watering hole types of attacks as well. So again, if you're interested in that kind of thing, the interesting thing we found is that, and the reason that we called them the Elderwood Gang, is that with a number of these attacks that we saw. There were some elements within the code, within the malicious code that we found that were similar. And in this case, we found that they were using this variable that was called Elderwood, and they would use this over and over again. And it was mainly attacks against sort of defense, type of industries. And so, for that reason, we decided to call them the Elderwood Gang. But it really makes for some interesting reading if you have a chance. And in terms of the effectiveness of these watering hole attacks, there was one case where last year we found that one of these particular attacks, immediately, or rather within 24 hours, very quickly infected some 500 companies, just like that. So these kind of attacks do seem to be quite effective. And a really interesting example is if you look back to the beginning of this year, around February. There were, throughout the news, you probably would have seen this case where Facebook and Twitter and Apple and so on all mentioned that they'd been hacked, and the way that some of these large companies with a lot of resources behind them, the way that they were attacked was in this manner. So the way it happened was that there were a few guys, I think it was one or two guys in California, who were running this website. So it was just it's a proper website. There's a forum associated with it and so on, and it was very useful for developers of iOS applications. And what happened is that very very small organization. Again, one or two people, very limited resources from a security point of view, but also at the same time very widely used website. This particular website was hacked, and the malware was installed on it, and that ended up being kind of the backdoor into a lot of these bigger organizations. So this is these are some of the trends that we're seeing, and it's quite interesting that as much as big organizations have a lot of money to spend on security, which is great, but the reality is that some smaller ones can very much form part of the attack puzzle. And so I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen some of these numbers before, and this is very much in line with what we're seeing. Is that the total amount of spam in the world does seem to be on the decline, and part of the reason for that is that we, along with some of the other vendors out there, we are working with the authorities in terms of taking down some of these botnets, and of course web or email filtering technology has helped as well. But the interesting thing also is the way that we see this big decline in pharmaceutical spam. So I can only guess that the guys who were pushing out a lot of this stuff were probably moved on to other things by now. So in terms of the zero-day vulnerabilities that we're seeing, again, going back to this Elderwood group that I mentioned, we've, again, because of the code that we've analyzed, we've associated them with a number of these zero-day vulnerabilities that we've seen over the last few years. And so, I mean, the amount of vulnerabilities generally is keeping quite steady. So we're not seeing a massive increase or a massive decrease by any means. But of course, most of the attacks, in general, most of the attacks that we see that are taking place tend to make use of these older vulnerabilities with unpatched machines. So again, email, of course, a big vector, as everyone knows, for causing infections and naturally websites as well. So as we've seen with these kind of targeted watering hole type of attacks, and as well as just attacks in general, we're seeing that a lot more of these proper websites are being infected and being used against the users. So just out of curiosity, I mean, how many people have seen this kind of thing before? These ransomware? Yeah, we've at least one, or a few hands up. Great. Okay, because this is something I find almost every time I go to a meeting, it seems to be becoming more and more common in the way that this type of attack, this ransomware attack, this is something that it actually started in Russia in 2009. And started to make its way across, going west through Western Europe, and so after Russia, we started to see it pop up in Germany, and then really in the last 12 months, starting to appear more and more in Canada. And the interesting thing behind these kinds of attacks is that is that what they'll do is they'll kind of shame the user. Okay, so there's a lot of social engineering at play here. And originally, when we saw these attacks happening, quite often, the guys performing these would buy advertising space on porn sites, and so quite often the person who clicked on the advertising link on a porn site would then get infected and see this, so that as soon as they see the message that, oh hey, you've been doing something bad and blah blah blah, and it's the government of Canada and we're watching you. And so on, and here's this threat of going to jail and so on, right? It adds a bit of weight to it, but at the same time, we also hear that a lot of people, they just want to get rid of this. So for them, they sometimes think that, okay, well, this is happening, and even though they don't necessarily believe it, they think that maybe it's easier to just pay these guys and they'll unlock your machine and so on. But typically we find that if you do pay them, they aren't that nice, right? So they don't actually go and unlock the machine. But so it's quite interesting. You'll see that they make it look all official and so on. And some of the other things they'll do is they'll also, in some cases we've seen, they'll turn on the webcam, or they'll publish the IP information, so that they'll show who your service provider is and so on. And again, all of these things kind of add up into this really kind of tricky social engineering. And and I think going forward, I'm sure these guys will come up with even more creative methods to try this stuff. And of course, these kinds of threats, these are pretty much the opposite in a lot of ways of the kind of silent watering hole style attacks that I was talking about earlier. Those ones are all very silent, of course, happening in the background. This is very obvious. So in some ways, we think that the criminal gangs who are doing this, are probably pissing off some of the guys who are trying to be silent. So it's I'm sure within the underworld there's probably some conversations being had. But the interesting thing here is that again they have there's a bit of intelligence in terms of the way this works. Quite often the code will look to see, figure out, using geolocation services, figure out, where your IP is, and then once it figures that out, it'll then download the appropriate display. So that, of course, if you're in, again, Germany with the Bundespolizei or the UK or something, it'll show the appropriate, government logos. And the interesting thing behind this, we analyzed one of the command and control servers that we captured, and we could see that we could see all of the different machines out there that were sending back information to it, And as well, we could see how many people were putting in valid cash cards. Because the way that they're making money is by having people go to the corner store and buy this certain kind of cash card and then put in a valid code. And so based on that, it looked like from 1 month of data, we could figure out that these guys were making something like $1 million, right? So even though they were affecting all these people and maybe 1% were paying, all that the small amount of money, of course, really adds up. So it's so definitely that monetary incentive is there for them to continue and come up with more tricky means of causing these kinds of infections. So in terms of mobile malware, this is quite interesting in terms of there's a lot of vulnerabilities that we're finding on iOS. But if you look at how those vulnerabilities do they correlate into the total number of threats? Well, in this case, the answer is no. Of course, there's a lot more threats to Android, but again, the vulnerabilities that we're finding are much more. That there's a lot more of them on the iOS platform, and of course, that might change in the future. But also, what is this mobile malware? What is it trying to do? And we find that by far and away, most of the malware on mobile devices is trying to steal information. Okay, so quite often we see that they'll try to steal your list of contacts and then make use of that list for one of their sort of email campaigns, right? So there's a whole process there for those guys. And in terms of again, social engineering at work here, this is an interesting example, right? So this particular app, it looks like it's it's a solar charger for your phone, which I know personally when my iPhone runs out battery always very quickly, I would love it if that was possible, but of course that's not possible. But again, it's very enticing for the users, and in this case, what this app would do is it would steal the contact information. And in terms of some of the trends that we're seeing with Macs, definitely 2012 was the number of threats against for Macs was definitely on the rise, and but in the Macs that we've analyzed, what we've found is that people are browsing different websites and so on, and they're downloading all of this malware that can only run on Windows. So 97.5% of that malware getting downloaded and that exists on Macs can't actually run, of course. So but the reality is that there is that small percentage that is increasing. So we see something like 2.5% where it can work. And the thing is, because if that malware can run on the Mac, then of course it can cause very widespread damage. In terms of there was this one threat that we saw last year, Flashback, which infected I think something like 1% of the Macs in the world. So it's so there's a lot of damage that can be done there. And yeah, that pretty much wraps it up for me. So again, I know it's sort of a quick overview of the trends 2012. And if you are interested in this kind of thing, of course, we're always publishing a lot of white papers on these topics. Again, I would if you look for quite an interesting read, the Elderwood Gang white paper is quite fascinating. People always ask, is it the Chinese or is it the U.S. government? And I think to Travis's point earlier, now we're all asking ourselves, is it people in Ottawa? All right, so it's a very interesting topic, and of course this whole landscape is continuously evolving. And thanks very much for listening, and have a happy Friday.